Good afternoon. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Welcome to Quarantine Storytime. I'm Charlotte, and we are reading War and Peace. But as we've been saying, we're making a lot of progress, and we're almost done. Yay! I hope you guys are as excited as I am. So because we're getting close to the end, I'm getting excited to finish. So we've been doing longer readings. Readings are now closer to an hour a day, which is fine because even if you can't tune in all day or for the whole thing, you can always pop back in and pick it up from all the videos end up in my War and Peace playlist. So you can always pick it up there. Or if you pop in the middle of the stream, you can always go back. If I'm streaming live, when you pop in, and we're already in the middle, go ahead and you can always drag it back to the beginning and start from the beginning and catch up on your own time. So that's always a great option. Hey, I have the live chat up, so feel free to say hi. Mom's here. Hey, Mom. Ignore the fact that I'm breaking out. We are testing a new microphone today, so give a welcome to our new participant. Let me know how the sound quality is on this one. The only feedback I had was yesterday. You said that the microphone wasn't as good as on Friday, which is interesting because it actually was the exact same microphone as Friday. But the only thing was that there was a pop filter pop filter on it, which is just sort of like a light screen that goes in front of a microphone. Sometimes you'll see them in old timey movies. They'll be like a little circle that has like mesh in it in front of a microphone, and it's just so that when you make hard consonant sounds like a P or a B or a T or a K, the force of your breath from your voice doesn't create a popping sound on the mic. So it's called a pop filter. So the only difference was between Friday and yesterday was that I put a pop filter in front of the microphone. So it was interesting because I did notice when I played back some of it, it did sound like tinnier in a weird way. So I may go back and try that microphone again one more time without it, just to see what's up with the sound quality. It could have been where I was placing it, could have been where I was talking. Maybe I was talking a little bit past it or not close enough, because a lot of the voiceover mics you kind of need to be close to. But because I'm also reading into the camera for you guys, I don't want like the microphone right in front of my face. So that could also play with the sound quality. And it could play with the sound quality with this one. So we will see. So there's that. Also, if anyone has ideas for books for after this, any other classic literature, or if you have an original work that you'd like me to read for you, let me know. I always love a good collaboration. What else? So yesterday we finished part 4, volume 2. So today we start part 4, volume 3, and we'll get halfway through that. So that'll be sections 1 through 9 today. And yeah, let me know if you guys have any thoughts on that. And the French army is in retreat, heading out of Russia. And they are taking prisoners with them. So our friend Pierre is with the French army as they leave Moscow. So, without too much further ado, let's go ahead and get into it and just see where we're at. All right, so part 3, volume 1. The Battle of Borodino, with the subsequent occupation of Moscow by the French and their flight without any new battles, is one of the most instructive phenomena in history. All historians agree that the external activity of states and nations in their conflicts among themselves is expressed in wars, that the political power of states and nation increases or decreases owing directly to their greater or lesser military successes. However strange the historical descriptions of how some king or emperor, having quarreled with another emperor or king, raised an army, fought with the army of the enemy, defeated it, killed 3, 5, 10,000 men, and as a result subjugated a state and a whole nation of several millions, however incomprehensible the reason why the defeat of one army, 1/100th of all the forces of the nation, made the nation submit, all the facts of history, insofar as it is known to us, confirm the correctness of the statement that the greater or lesser successes of the army of one nation against the army of another nation are the causes, or at least the essential sign, of an increase or decrease in the strength of the nation. An army wins a victory, and at once the rights of the victorious nation increase, to the detriment of the vanquished one. An army suffers a defeat, and at once, according to the degree of the defeat, the nation is deprived of rights, and in the case of a total defeat of their army, is totally subjugated. So it has been, according to history, from the most ancient times to the present. All the wars of Napoleon serve as a confirmation of this rule. To the degree that the Austrian army is defeated, Austria is deprived of her rights, and the rights and the strength of France increase. The victories of the French at Jena and Auerstadt destroy the independent existence of Prussia. But suddenly, in the year 1812, the French win a victory at Moscow. Moscow is taken, and following that with no new battles, it is not Russia that ceases to exist, but the 600,000-man French army ceases to exist. And after that Napoleonic France. To stretch the facts to fit the rules of history by saying that the battlefield of Borodino remained Russian, that there were battles after Moscow which destroyed Napoleon's army, is impossible. After the victory of the French at Borodino, not only was there no general battle, but there was not even in any way significant. There was even none in any way significant, yet the French army ceased to exist. What does it mean? If it was an example from the history of China, we might say that it was not a historical event, the historian's loophole, when something does not fit their yardstick. If it was a matter of a brief clash involving a small number of troops, we could take it for an exceptional phenomenon. But this event took place before the eyes of our fathers, for whom the question of life or death of the fatherland was decided, and this war was the greatest of all known wars. The period in the campaign of 1812, from the Battle of Borodino to the expulsion of the French, proved that a battle won is not only not the cause of a conquest, but is not even an invariable sign of conquest. It proved that the forces that decide the destiny of nations, lie not in conquerors, not even in armies and battles, but in something else. French historians, describing the situation of the French army before leaving Moscow, affirm that everything in the Grand Army was in order, except the cavalry, the artillery, and the transport, and there was also no forage to feed the horses and cattle. There was no help for this calamity because the muzhiks of the region burned their hay rather than give it to the French. The battle won did not bring the usual results because the muzhiks, Karp and Vlas, who, after the French moved on, came to Moscow with their carts to loot the city and in general did not manifest any personal heroic sentiments, and all the countless number of muzhiks like them did not bring hay to Moscow for the good money they were offered, but burned it. Let us imagine two men who come with swords to fight a duel by all the rules of the art of fencing. The fighting went on for quite a long time. Suddenly, one of the adversaries, feeling himself wounded, realizing it was not a joking matter, but something that concerned his life, threw down his sword and, picking up the first club he found, started brandishing it. But let us imagine that the man who so sensibly employed the best and simplest means to attain his goal, inspired at the same time by the traditions of chivalry, wished to conceal the essence of the matter and insisted they had won the sword fight by all the rules of the art. One can imagine what confusion and obscurity would come from such a description of the duel that took place. The French were the fencer who demanded a fight by the rules of the art. The Russians were the adversary who dropped his sword and picked up a club. Those who attempt to explain everything by the rules of fencing are the historians who have written about this event. From the time of the burning of Smolensk, a war began that did not fit any of the former traditions of war. The burning of towns and villages, the retreats after battles, the blow struck at Borodino and then another retreat, the abandoning and burning of Moscow, the hunt for marauders, the cutting off of transport, the partisan war. These were all deviations from the rules. Napoleon sensed that, and from the moment when he stopped in Moscow and in the correct position of a fencer, instead of his adversary's sword, saw a club raised over him, he never ceased complaining to Kutuzov and the Emperor Alexander that the war was being conducted against all the rules, as if there existed some sort of rules for killing people. Despite the complaints of the French about the non-fulfillment of the rules, despite the fact that highly placed Russians thought it shameful for some reason to fight with the club and wanted to follow the rules and assume a position en contre or en tierce, make a skillful thrust en prime, and so on, the club of a national war was raised with all its terrible and majestic power, and not asking about anyone's tastes or rules, with stupid simplicity but with expediency, not sorting anything out, rose and fell and hammered on the French until the whole invasion was destroyed. And blessed is that nation which, not like the French in the year 1813, who saluted by all the rules of the art and turning the sword hilt first, graciously and courteously handed it to the magnanimous victor, but which, in the moment of trial, not asking how others have acted according to the rules on such occasions, simply and easily raises the first club that comes along and hammers with it until the feeling of outrage and revenge in its soul gives place to contempt and pity. Section 2. One of the most palpable and advantageous deviations from the so-called rules of war is the act of scattered people against people pressed together in a mass. This kind of action always emerges in a war that acquires a national character. These actions consist in the fact that, instead of a crowd opposing a crowd, people scatter, attack singly, and flee as soon as large forces attack them, then attack again as soon as the opportunity arises. This was done by the guerrillas in Spain, it was done by the mountaineers in the Caucasus, it was done by the Russians in the year 1812. Warfare of this kind has been named partisan warfare, and those who named it supposed that, by doing so, they were explaining its meaning. Yet this kind of warfare not only does not fit into any rules, but is directly opposed to a tactical rule that is well known and acknowledged as infallible. This rule says that an attacker should concentrate his troops in order to be stronger at the moment of battle. Partisan warfare, always successful as history demonstrates, is directly opposed to this rule. This contradiction proceeds from the fact that military science assumes the strength of an army to be identical with its numbers. Military science says that the bigger the army, the stronger it is. Les gros bataillons ont toujours raison. In saying that, military science is like a mechanics which, considering forces only in relation to their mass, would say that forces are equal or not equal to each other because their masses are or are not equal. Force, the quantity of motion, is the product of a mass times velocity. In military action, the force of an army is also the product of mass times something, some unknown, x. Military science, seeing from a countless number of examples in history that the mass of an army does not coincide with its force, that small detachments defeat larger ones, vaguely recognizes the existence of this unknown multiplier and tries to find in either its geometric disposition or its armaments, or, most commonly, in the genius of the commander. But the substitution of all these values for the multiplier does not produce results that agree with the historical facts. And yet, one need only renounce the false view established to please the heroes of the validity of orders from the higher power in times of war in order to find this unknown X. This X is the spirit of the army. That is, the greater or lesser desire to fight and subject themselves to danger on the part of all men who make up the army, regardless of whether they are fighting under the command of geniuses or not, in 3 lines or 2, with clubs or with guns that fire 30 rounds a minute. Men who have the greatest desire to fight will always put themselves in the most advantageous conditions for fighting. The spirit of an army is the multiplier of the mass that yields the product of the force. To determine and express the value of that unknown multiplier, the spirit of an army, is the task of science. This task is possible only if we stop arbitrarily substituting for the value of the whole unknown X the conditions under which the force is manifested, to wit, the orders of the commander, armaments, and so on. Taking them for the value of the multiplier and recognize this unknown in its entirety, that is, as the greater or lesser desire to fight and subject oneself to danger. Only then, expressing known historical facts in equations, may we hope, by comparing the relative values of this unknown, to define the unknown itself. 10 men, battalions or divisions, fighting against 15 men, battalions or divisions, defeated the 15, that is, killed or captured them to a man, and lost 4 themselves. Thus, on one side 4, and on the other side 15 were cancelled. Therefore, 4 were equal to 15, and therefore 4x equals 15y. Therefore, x equals y, x to y equals 15 to 4. This equation does not give us the value of the unknown, but it gives the ratio between 2 unknowns. And by bringing various historical units, battles, campaigns, periods of war, into such equations, we will obtain a series of numbers in which laws should exist and may be discovered. The tactical rule that there should be massed action in attack and dispersed action in retreat only confirms unwittingly the truth that the strength of an army depends on its spirit. To lead men under cannonballs, there is a need for greater discipline, achieved only by mass action, than to repulse the attackers. But this rule, which loses sight of the spirit of the army, always proves wrong and is especially flagrant contradiction to reality wherever there exists a strong rise or fall in the spirit of the army, as in all national wars. The French, retreating in 1812, though according to tactics they should defend themselves separately, press together in a mass because the spirit of the army has fallen, and only its mass holds the army together. The Russians, on the contrary, should, according to tactics, be attacking in mass, but in fact they break up because the spirit has risen so much that separate persons beat the French without any orders and need not be forced to subject themselves to difficulties and dangers. Section 3. The so-called partisan war began with the entrance of the enemy into Smolensk. Before the partisan war was officially accepted by our government, thousands of men of the enemy line, lingering marauders, foragers, were exterminated by the Cossacks and muzhiks who killed these men off as unconsciously as dogs bite to death a rabid stray dog. Denis Davyadov, with his Russian intuition, was the first to understand the meaning of that terrible club which, without inquiring into the rules of military art, was destroying the French, and to him belongs the glory of the first step towards legitimizing this method of warfare. On the 24th of August, Davidov's first partisan detachment was formed, and after that others began to be formed. The further the campaign moved, the greater the number of these detachments grew. The partisans were destroying the Grand Army piecemeal. They gathered up the dry leaves that fell by themselves from the withered tree of the French army and occasionally shook that tree. By October, when the French were fleeing towards Smolensk, there were hundreds of these parties of various sizes and characters. There were parties that imitated all the methods of an army, with infantry, artillery, staffs, and the conveniences of life. There were some of the Cossacks of cavalry, there were small combined ones, foot and horse. There were peasants and landowners' parties unknown to anyone. There was a party commanded by a beetle which took several hundred prisoners in a month. There was Vasilisa, a village headman's wife, who destroyed hundreds of the French. The last days of October were the hottest times of the partisan war. The initial period of this war, a time when the partisans, surprised at their own boldness, were afraid every moment of being caught and surrounded by the French, hid in the forest without unsaddling their horses and hardly ever dismounted, expecting every moment to be pursued, had already passed. Now this war was already defined. It had become clear to everyone what could and could not be undertaken with the French. Now only those leaders of detachments who had staffs, followed rules, and moved about at a distance from the French considered many things impossible. The small partisan groups, who had long been in action and watched the French from close up, considered things possible that the leaders of large detachments did not dare think of. The Cossacks and the peasants who got in among the French considered that anything was now possible. On the 22nd of October, Denisov, being one of the partisans, found himself with his party in the very heat of partisan passion. He and his party had been on the road since the morning. All day from the forest stretching along the high road, he had been watching a large French transport of cavalry supplies and Russian prisoners, which was separated from the rest of the army and under heavy cover, as was known from scouts and prisoners, was heading for Smolensk. Not only Denisov and Dolokhov, also a partisan with a small party, who moved about close to Denisov, but the leaders of large detachments with staff as well, all of them knew about this transport and, as Denisov said, were whetting their teeth for it. Two of these large detachment leaders, one a Pole, the other a German, almost simultaneously sent Denisov an invitation to join each of their detachments in order to attack the transport. "No, brother, I've been around long enough," said Denisov, having read these papers, and he wrote to the German that, despite his heartfelt wish to serve under the command of such a valiant and famous general, he had to deprive himself of that happiness because he had already put himself under the command of the Pole. To the Polish general he wrote the same, informing that he had already put himself under the German's command. I love this guy. Having arranged everything in this way, Denisov, together with Dolokhov, intended, without reporting to the higher command, to attack and take this transport with their own small forces. The transport was going, on the 22nd of October, from the village of Mikulino to the village of Shamshevo. To the left of the road from Mykolino to Shemshevo, there were big forests, in some places coming right down to the road, in some moving back from the road to a distance of half a mile or more. Denisov and his party had been moving through these forests all day, now going deep into the middle of them, now riding out into the open, not losing sight of the moving French. In the morning, not far from Mykolino, where the forest came close to the road, Cossacks from Denisov's party had captured 2 wagons of cavalry saddles that were bogged down in the mud and had driven them into the forest. From then on until evening, the party, without attacking, had followed the movement of the French. They had, without frightening them, to let them go peacefully as far as Shemshevo, and then, joining up with Dolokhov, who was to arrive by evening for a meeting at a guardhouse a mile from Shemshevo, to fall upon them at dawn out of the blue and kill or capture them all at once. Six Cossacks were left behind, a mile and a half from Mykolino, where the forest came down right down to the road, who were to inform them at once as soon as new French columns appeared. On the other side of Shemshevo, Dolokhov was to keep an eye on the road in the same way to find out how far away the other French troops were. There were supposed to be 1,500 men with the transport. Denisov had 200 men. Dolokhov might rally the same number, but the superiority of the number did not stop Denisov. There was only one thing he still needed to know, which was precisely what sort these troops were. For that purpose, Denisov needed to capture a tongue, that is, a soldier from the enemy column. In the morning attack on the wagons, the business had been done with such haste that all the French with the wagons had been killed, and the only one taken alive was a drummer boy who was half-witted and could say nothing positive about what sort of troops were with the column. Denisov considered it dangerous to attack another time for fear of disturbing the whole column, and therefore he sent ahead to Shemshevo the Muzhik, Tikhon Sherbati, who was in his party, to capture at least one of the French vanguard who were taking up quarters there. Section 4. Yeah, Tolstoy got really mathy there for a second. Section 4. It was a warm, rainy autumn day. The sky and the horizon were both the color of muddy water. Now the fog seemed to descend. Now a slanting rain would suddenly come down in big drops. Denisov, in a felt coat and a papakha, streaming with water, rode on a lean, purebred horse with drawn-in flanks. Like his horse, who kept moving its head sideways and laying its ear flat, he winced from the slanting rain and peered ahead worriedly. His emaciated face, overgrown with a thick, short, black beard, looked angry. Besides Denisov, also in a felt coat and a papakha, was a big, well-nourished Don Stallion. On a big, well-nourished Don Stallion rode a Cossack Isyol, Denisov's associate. He's a captain. The Isyol, Lovesky, was a tall, white-faced, fair-haired man, flat as a board, with narrow, pale eyes and a calmly smug expression in his face and bearing. Though it was impossible to say what made for the peculiarity of the horse and rider, from a first glance at the Isyol and at Denisov, one could see that Denisov felt wet and awkward, that he was a man sitting on a horse. While, looking at the Isyol, one could see that he felt as comfortable and as ease as ever, and that he was not a man sitting on a horse, but a man who was one with a horse, a being of twice increased strength. A little ahead of them walked a soaking wet little peasant, their guide, in a gray caftan and a white cap. A little behind them, on a skinny, slender Kyrgyz nag, with an enormous mane and tail and lips so torn that they bled, rode a young officer in a dark blue French greatcoat. Beside him rode a hussar, with a boy in a tattered French uniform and a blue cap sitting behind him on his horse's croup. The boy held on to the hussar with hands red from the cold, moved his bare feet in an effort to warm them, and raising his eyebrows looked around in surprise. This was the French drummer boy captured in the morning. Behind, by threes, by fours, along the narrow, sodden, much-traveled forest road, stretched hussars, then Cossacks, some in felt cloaks, some in French greatcoats, some with horse blankets pulled over their heads. The horses, Bay and Sorrel, all looked black from the rain streaming off them. The horses' necks seemed strangely thin because of their drenched manes. Steam rose from the horses. Clothes, saddles, reins, everything was wet, slippery, and soggy, like the ground and the fallen leaves that covered the road. The men sat looking ruffled up, trying not to stir, so as to keep the water warm that had seeped through to the body and not let in new, cold water that flowed under their seats, knees, and behind their necks. Between the strung-out Cossacks, the two wagons, hitched to French and saddled Cossack horses, rumbled over stumps and branches and gurgled through the water-filled ruts of the road. Denisov's horse, swerving around a puddle that was in its way, pulled to the side and bumped its rider's knee into a tree. The devil, Denisov cried angrily, and baring his teeth, he gave his horse 3 strokes of the whip, splashing himself and his comrades with mud. Denisov was in a foul mood because of the rain, and because he was hungry. No one had eaten anything since morning, and above all because there was no word from Dolokhov, and the man sent to take a prisoner had not come back. There could hardly be another such occasion as today for attacking the transport. To attack alone is too risky, but put it off to another day, and some bigger party will snatch the booty right from under our noses, thought Denisov, constantly glancing ahead, hoping to see the expected messenger from Dolokhov. Emerging into a clearing, there one could see far ahead to the right. Denisov stopped. "Somebody's coming," he said. The Esau looked in the direction in which Denisov was pointing. "There are 2 coming, an officer and a Cossack, only it's not presupposable that it's the lieutenant colonel himself," said the Esau, who liked to use words unknown to the Cossacks. The riders descended the hill, disappeared from sight, and reappeared in a few minutes. In front, at a weary gallop, applying his whip, rode an officer, disheveled, soaked through, his trousers bunched up above his knee. Behind him, standing in the stirrups, trotted a Cossack. This officer, a very young boy with a broad, red-cheeked face and quick, merry eyes, galloped up to Denisov and handed him a wet envelope. "From the general," said the officer. "Sorry it's not quite dry." Denisov, frowning, took the envelope and began to open it. "They keep saying it's dangerous." "Dangerous," said the officer, turning to the Esau, while Denisov read the letter handed to him. "Anyhow, me and Kamarov," he pointed to the Cossack, "are ready. Each of us has 2 pistols." "What? But what's that?" he asked, seeing the French drummer boy. "A prisoner? You've already been in battle. Can I talk to him?" "Rostov, Petya!" Denisov cried out just then, having looked through the envelope handed to him. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" And Denisov turned with a smile and gave the officer his hand. This officer was Petya Rostov. On the way there, Petya had been preparing the way he, as a grown man and an officer, without hinting at their former acquaintance, would behave with Denisov. But as soon as Denisov smiled at him, Petya at once beamed, blushed for joy, and forgetting his prepared officialness, began to tell how he had ridden past the French and how glad he was that he had been given such an errand, and that he had already been in battle in Vyazma, and that a certain hussar had distinguished himself there. "Well, I'm very glad to see you," Denisov interrupted him, and his face again assumed a preoccupied expression. "Mikhail Fikolich," he said. He turned to the Esau. "This one is from the German again. He's attached to him." Denisov told the Esau that the content of the letter just brought consisted of a repeated request to join him in attacking the transport. "If we don't take it tomorrow, they'll snatch it from under our noses," he concluded. While Denisov was talking with the Esau, Petya, abashed by Denisov's cold tone and supposing that the cause of it was the state of his trousers, was straightening them under his greatcoat so that no one would notice, trying to look as martial as possible. "Will there be any orders from your honor?" he said to Denisov, putting his hand to his visor and turning again to the game of adjutant and general which he had been prepared for. "Or shall I stay with your honor?" "Orders?" Denisov said pensively. "But can you stay until tomorrow?" "Ah, please, may I stay with you?" cried Petya. "And exactly what did the general tell you to return at once?" asked Denisov. Petya blushed. "He didn't tell me anything." "I think I can," he said questioningly. "Well, all right," said Denisov, and turning to his subordinates, he gave instructions for the party to go to the appointed resting place by the guardhouse in the forest, and for the officer on the Kyrgyz horse, this officer functioning as an adjutant, to go looking for Dolokhov, to find out where he was and whether he would come in the evening. Denisov himself, with the Esau and Petya, intended to ride up to the edge of the forest that came out at Shemshevo in order to look over the place where the French were camped, at which the next day's attack should be directed. Well, Chaybio, he turned to the Muzhik guide, lead us to Shemshevo. Denisov, Petya, and the Esau, accompanied by several Cossacks and the hussar, who was carrying the prisoner, rode left across a ravine to the edge of the forest. Section 5. The light rain stopped. Only mist fell and drops of water from the branches of the trees. Denisov, the Esau, and Petya rode silently after the Muzhik and the Cap, who, stepping lightly and noiselessly over the roots and wet leaves with his splayed feet in bast shoes, led them to the edge of the forest. Going up a slope, the Muzhik paused, looked around, and made for the thinning wall of trees. By a big oak still covered with leaves, he stopped and beckoned mysteriously with his hand. Denisov and Petya rode up to him. From the place where the Muzhik had stopped, the French could be seen. Just beyond the forest, a field of spring wheat descended over a low knoll. To the right, across a steep ravine, a small village and a manor house with broken-down roofs could be seen. In this village and in the manor house and all over the knoll, in the garden, by the wells and the pond, and along the road uphill from the bridge to the village, no more than 400 yards away, crowds of men could be seen through the undulating mist. One could clearly hear their non-Russian shouts at the horses pulling wagons up the hill and their calls to one another. "Bring the prisoner here," Denisov said in a low voice, without taking his eyes off the French. The Cossack got off his horse, took the boy down, and went up to Denisov with him. Denisov, pointing to the French, asked what kind of troops these and those were. The boy, putting his chilled hands in his pocket and raising his eyebrows, looked at Denisov in fear, and despite his obvious wish to tell all he knew, became confused in his answers and only confirmed what Denisov asked. Denisov frowned, turned away from him, and addressed the Esau, telling him his considerations. Petya, quickly turning his head, looked now at the drummer boy, now at Denisov, now at the Esau, now at the French in the village and on the road, trying not to miss anything important. "Whether Dolokhov comes or not, we've got to take them, right?" said Denisov with a merry sparkle in his eyes. "It's a convenient place," said the Esau. We'll send the infantry from below, through the marshes," Denisov went on. "They'll sneak up the garden. You and the Cossacks will ride around from them." Denisov pointed to the forest behind the village. "And I'll come from here with my hussars. At the signal shot—" "We can't go through the hollow. It's swampy," said the Esau. "The horses will get bogged down. We'll have to go around more to the left." As they were talking like that in half-whispers, a shot cracked below, in the hollow by the pond. They saw a puff of white smoke, then another, and heard the concentrated, merry-sounding shout of hundreds of voices of the French who were on the hillside. At the first moment, Denisov and the Esau drew back. They were so close that they thought they were the cause of the shots and shouts, but the shots and shouts had nothing to do with them. Below, across the marsh, ran a man in something red. Obviously, the French were shooting and shouting at him. "Why, that's our Tikhon," said the Esau. "It's him! Him!" "What a rascal," said Denisov. "He'll get away," the Esau said, narrowing his eyes. The man they called Tikhon ran to the river, popped into it with a splash, and disappeared for a moment, clambering out on all fours, black from the water, and ran on. The French who were running after him stopped. "That's nimble," said the Esau. "What a rogue," Denisov said with the same expression of vexation. "What's he been up to all this time?" "Who is he?" asked Petya. "He's a plastun. I sent him there to take a tongue." A plastun is a scout. "Ah, yes," said Petya, nodding his head at Denisov's first words as if he understood everything, though he decidedly did not understand a single word. Tikhon Sherbati was one of the most necessary men in the party. He was a muzhik from Pokrovsko near Gazat. When, at the beginning of his operations, Denisov had come to Pokrovsko and, as usual, summoned the headman and asked what they knew about the French, the headman had answered, as all headmen would, as if defending himself, that he knew nothing, had seen nothing. But when Denisov explained that his aim was to kill the French and asked whether the French had happened to come there, the headman said that, in fact, some marauders had been there, and that in their village only Gap-toothed Tishka concerned himself with such doings. Denisov told him to summon Tikhon, and having praised him for his activity, said a few words in front of the headman about loyalty to the Tsar and the fatherland, and the hatred for the French that the sons of the fatherland should observe. "We do no harm to the French," said Tikhon, clearly cowed by these words of Denisov's. "We just went hunting and had some fun with the lads. We did kill some couple of dozen marauders, but otherwise we did no harm." The next day, when Denisov, forgetting entirely about this muzhik, left Pokrovskoe, it was reported to him that Tikhon had attached himself to the party and asked to be allowed to stay with it. Denisov said he could stay. Tikhon, who at first did the dirty work of making campfires, carrying water, skinning horses, and so on, soon showed great zeal and ability for partisan warfare. At night, he went after booty and came back each time bringing some French clothing or weapons, and, when told to, also brought in prisoners. Denisov relieved Tikhon from work, began taking him with him on patrol, and enlisted him as a Cossack. Tikhon did not like riding and always went on foot, never lagging behind the cavalry. His weapons were a musketoon, which he strapped on mainly for amusement, a pike, and an axe, which he used as a wolf does its teeth, with equal ease picking fleas out of its fur or biting through thick bones. Tikhon, with equal precision, could swing his axe to split logs, or taking it by the butt, whittle thin pegs or carved spoons. In Denisov's party, Tikhon occupied his own exceptional place. When there was a need to do something especially difficult or nasty, to haul a cart out of the mud with one's shoulders, to pull a horse out of the swamp by its tail or skin it, to slip right into the middle of the French, to walk 30 miles a day, everyone pointed, chuckling at Tikhon. "What harm will it do the devil? He's sturdy as an ox," they said of him. Once a Frenchman Tikhon was about to capture shot at him with a pistol and hit him in the soft hindquarters. This wound, which Tikhon treated only with vodka, internally and externally, was the object of the merriest jokes in the whole party, jokes to which Tikhon willingly yielded. "Never again, nay, brother, all doubled up," the Cossacks laughed at him, and Tikhon, doubling up on purpose and making faces, pretending to be angry, denounced the French with the funniest oaths. The only influence this incident had on Tikhon was that after his wound, he rarely brought in prisoners. Tikhon was the bravest and most useful man in the party. Nobody found more chances for attacking than he. No one captured or killed more of the French, and as a result of that, he was a buffoon for all the Cossacks and hussars, and willingly accepted that rank. Now Tikhon had been sent by Denisov to Shemshevo during the night in order to take a tongue, but either because he was not satisfied with one prisoner or because he had slept through the night, he had slipped by day into some bushes right in the middle of the French, and as Denisov had seen from the hill, had been discovered by them. Section 6. Having talked a while with the Esau about the next day's attack, which Denisov, seeing the closeness of the French, now seemed to have definitively resolved upon, he turned his horse and rode back. "Well, brother, now let's go and get dry," he said to Petya. Riding up to the forest guardhouse, Denisov stopped, peering into the forest. In the forest, among the trees, a man was walking with big, light strides, on long legs with long, swinging arms, wearing a jacket, bast shoes, and a Kazan hat, with a gun over his shoulder and an axe in his belt. Seeing Denisov, this man hastily flung something into the bushes and taking off his soaked hat with its drooping brim, went up to his commander. It was Tikhon. His pock-marked and wrinkled face, with its small, narrow eyes, beamed with self-satisfied merriment. Raising his head high as if trying to keep from laughing, he fixed his eyes on Denisov. "Well, where did you disappear to?" said Denisov. "Disappear to? I went after the French," Tikhon replied boldly and quickly, in a hoarse but melodious bass. "Why did you slip in there during the day, brute? So you didn't take—" "I took one, I did," said Tikhon. "Where is he?" I took him first thing at dawn," Tikhon went on, moving his flat, splayed feet in their bast shoes further apart. "And I led him into the forest. I saw he wasn't the right sort. I thought, why don't I go and take another, more proper one?" "See, he's a rascal, that's what," Denisov said to the Esau. "Why didn't you bring that one?" Why bring him?" Tikhon interrupted crossly and quickly, "if he's no good. Don't I know what kind you need?" "Sly dog. So?" "I went after another," Tikhon continued. "I crawled into the forest like this and lay there." Tikhon unexpectedly and nimbly lay on his belly, acting out how he had done it. "One of them came along," he continued. "I grabbed him like this." Tikhon jumped up quickly and lightly. "Let's go to the colonel," I said. He started jabbering. 4 of them came. Fell on me with their little swords. I swung my axe like this. "Come on, Christ help you," Tikhon cried, swinging his arms, scowling terribly and thrusting out his chest. We saw from the hill how you cut and ran through the puddles, said the Esau, narrowing his bright eyes. Petya wanted very much to laugh, but he saw that they all kept from laughing. He quickly shifted his gaze from Tikhon's face to the Esau's and Denisov's, not understanding what it all meant. Don't play the fool, said Denisov, coughing crossly. Why didn't you bring the first one? Tikhon began to scratch his back with one hand and his head with the other. Suddenly his whole mug stretched into a beaming, foolish smile, revealing the missing tooth, for which he was named Sherbati, gap-toothed. Denisov smiled, and Petya dissolved into merry laughter in which Tikhon himself joined. No, but he was all wrong, said Tikhon. Such poor clothes on him. There was no point bringing him here. And a crude one, Your Honor. It's like this, he says. I'm a general's son. I won't go, he says. What a brute, said Denisov. I need to question. But I did ask him, said Tikhon. Things are bad, he says. In signs. There's lots of us, he says, but in poor shape, just in name only, he says. One good whack, he says, and you'll take them all, Tikhon concluded, glancing merrily and resolutely into Denisov's eyes. When you get 100 hot ones from me, they teach you to play the fool, Denisov said sternly. That'll teach you to play the fool. Why get angry, said Tikhon, as if I haven't seen your Frenchmen. Wait till it gets dark. I'll bring you any sort you like, even 3 of them. Well, let's go, said Denisov, and rode on until they came to the guardhouse, silent and frowning angrily. Tikhon walked behind, and Petya heard the Cossacks laughing with him and at him about some boots he had thrown into the bushes. When the laughter came over him at Tikhon's words and smile passed, and Petya realized for a moment that this Tikhon had killed a man, he felt uneasy. He glanced at the captive drummer boy and something stabbed his heart. But this uneasiness lasted only a moment. He felt a need to raise his head higher, to encourage himself, and to question the Esau about the next day's undertaking, assuming a significant air, so as not to be unworthy of the company he was in. The officer who had been sent met Denisov on the way with the news that Dolokhov himself would come at once and that, for his part, all was well. Denisov suddenly cheered up and called Petya to him. Well, tell me about yourself, he said. Section 7. Petya, having left his family on their departure from Moscow, had joined his regiment and soon after that was attached as an orderly to a general in command of a large detachment. Since the time of his promotion to officer, and especially since going on active duty, where he had taken part in the Battle of Vyazma, Petya had constantly been in a state of happy, excited joy that he was grown up, and in constantly rapturous haste not to miss any occasion for real heroism. He was very happy with what he had seen and experienced in the army, but at the same time it seemed to him all the same that he was not where was most real and heroic was now happening, and he hurried to get where he was not. When, on the 21st of October, his general expressed the wish to send something to Denisov's detachment, Petya begged so pitifully to be sent that the general could not refuse. But as he was sending him, the general, recalling Petya's mad behavior at the Battle of Vyazma, where instead of taking to the road and going where he had been sent, had galloped into the line under French fire and there shot twice shot off his pistol. As he was sending him, the general precisely forbade Petya to take part in any of Denisov's actions whatever. It was this that had made Petya blush and become confused when Denisov asked if he could stay. Until he rode out to the edge of the forest, Petya thought that in strict fulfillment of his duty, he ought to return at once. But when he saw Tikhon, and learned that there would certainly be an attack in the night, he, with the young man's quickness in changing his views, decided to himself that his general, whom till then he had respected very much, was trash. A German, that Denisov was a hero, and the Esau was a hero, and Tikhon was a hero, and it was shameful to leave them at a difficult moment. Night was already falling when Denisov, with Petya and the Esau, rode up to the guardhouse. In the semi-darkness they could see saddled horses, Cossacks, hussars, setting up little lean-tos in the clearing and making a glowing fire in the wooded ravine, so that the French could not see the smoke. In the front hall of the small cottage, a Cossack, his sleeves rolled up, was carving mutton. Inside the cottage itself, 3 officers from Denisov's party were setting up a table made from a door. Petya took off his wet things, handed them over to be dried, and at once began to assist the officers in setting up the dinner table. 10 minutes later, the table was ready, covered with a cloth. On the table stood vodka, a flask of rum, white bread, and a roast mutton with salt. Sitting with the officers at the table and tearing at a greasy hunk of fragrant mutton with his hands, which dripped with fat, Petya was in a rapturous, childlike state of tender love for all people and consequently of certainty that other people had the same love for him. "What do you think, Vasily Fedorovitch?" he said to Denisov. "Is it all right if I stay with you for one little day?" And not waiting for an answer, he answered himself, "I was told to find out, so I'll find out. Only let me go to the main. I don't need any rewards, but I'd like." Petya clenched his teeth and looked around, tossing his raised head and swinging his arms. "To the main," Denisov repeated, smiling. "Only please give me full command so that I can be in command," Petya went on. "What is it to you? Ah, you need a knife?" He turned to an officer who wanted to cut some mutton, and he gave him his pocket knife. The officer praised the knife. "Keep it, please. I've got many like it," Petya said, blushing. "Good heavens, I completely forgot," he suddenly cried. "I've got wonderful raisins, you know, the seedless kind. We have a new sutler, and such excellent things. I brought 10 pounds. I'm used to something sweet. Would you like some?" And Petya ran to the front hall to his Cossack and brought back bags with some 5 pounds of raisins. "Eat, gentlemen, eat." "And don't you need a coffee pot?" He turned to the esaul. I bought one from our sutler. It's wonderful. He has excellent things. He's very honest. That's the main thing. I'll make sure to send you one. Or maybe you're out of flints. They get used up, you know. I brought some along. I've got them here." He pointed to the bags. 100 flints. I bought them very cheap. Please, take as many as you like, or even all of them. And suddenly, afraid that he had let his tongue run away with him, Petya stopped and blushed. He began to recall whether he had done any other stupid things, and going through his memories of the day, he stopped at the memory of the French drummer boy. "It's fine for us, but how about him? Where have they put him? Have they fed him? Have they mistreated him?" he thought. But realizing they had gotten carried away with the flints, he was now wary. "I could ask," he thought, "but they'll say he's a boy himself and he feels sorry for a boy. I'll show them tomorrow what sort of boy I am. Will it be shameful if I ask?" thought Petya. "Well, what difference does it make?" And at once, blushing and looking fearfully at the officers to see if there was any mockery in their faces, he said, "And can I call the boy you captured to give him something to eat? Maybe." "Yes, a pitiful lad," said Denisov, obviously finding nothing shameful in this reminder. "Call him here. His name is Vincent Bosse. Call him." "I'll call him," said Petya. Call him, a pitiful lad," Denisov repeated. Petya was standing by the door when Denisov said that. He squeezed between the officers and went up close to Denisov. "Allow me to kiss you, dear heart," he said. "Ah, how excellent, how good." And having kissed Denisov, he ran outside. "Bossy, Vincent!" cried Petya, stopping by the door. "Who do you want, sir?" a voice said from the darkness. Petya replied that it was the French boy who had been captured that day. "Ah, Viseny," said a Cossack. His name, Vincent, had already been changed to Viseny by the Cossacks, into Visenya by the Muziks and soldiers. Both changes brought together a reminder of springtime with the idea of a young boy. "He's warming up by the fire. Hey, Visenya! Visenya! Viseny!" Echoing voices and laughter was heard in the darkness. "He's a sharp little lad," said a hussar who was standing by Petya. "We gave him something to eat earlier. He was dying of hunger." Footsteps were heard in the darkness, and the drummer boy, splashing barefoot through the mud, came up to the door. "Ah, c'est vous," said Petya. "Voulez-vous manger? N'ayez pas peur, on ne vous fera pas de mal," he added, touching his hand timidly and tenderly. "Entrez, entrez." "Merci, monsieur," the drummer boy replied in a trembling voice, almost a child's, and began wiping his muddy feet on the threshold. Petya would have liked to say many things to the drummer boy, but he did not dare. He took him into the front hall, shifting from foot to foot. Then he took his hand in the darkness and pressed it. "Entrez, entrez," he only repeated in a tender whisper. What can I do for him?" Petya said to himself, and opening the door, he let the boy go in past him. When the drummer boy had entered the cottage, Petya sat down at some distance from him, considering that it was humiliating for him to pay attention to him. He only felt the money in his pocket and wondered whether it would be shameful for him to give it to the drummer boy. Section 8. From the drummer boy, who at Denisov's instruction was given vodka and mutton, and whom Denisov ordered dressed in a Russian kaftan so that he would stay with the party and not be sent away with the prisoners, Petya's attention was distracted by the arrival of Dolokhov. In the army, Petya had heard many stories of Dolokhov's extraordinary courage and cruelty to the French, and therefore, once Dolokhov entered the village, Petya gazed at him without taking his eyes away, and kept encouraging himself by tossing his raised head so as not to be unworthy even of such company as Dolokhov. Dolokhov's appearance struck Petya strangely by its simplicity. Denisov was dressed in a Cossack coat, wore a beard and an icon of St. Nicholas the Wonder Worker on his chest, and his manner of speaking in all his ways expressed the singularity of his position. Dolokhov, on the contrary, who formerly in Moscow had worn Persian dress, now had the look of a prim officer of the guards. His face was clean-shaven, he was dressed in a padded guardsman's jacket with a St. George in the buttonhole, and in a simple peaked cap set straight on his head. He took off his wet felt cape in the corner and going up to Denisov without greeting anyone, at once began asking him about business. Denisov told him about the designs that the large detachments had on their transport, about the sending of Petya, and about his response to the two generals. Then Denisov told him all he knew about the position of the French. "That's all very well, but we must know what kind of troops they are and how many," said Dolokhov. "We'll have to go there. We can't go into action without knowing for certain how many there are. I like to do things neatly. So, gentlemen, does anyone want to go with me to their camp? I've got uniforms with me." Me, I'll go with you," cried Petya. "There's no need at all for you to go," said Denisov, addressing Dolokhov, "and him I won't let go for anything." "That's just fine," cried Petya. "Why can't I go?" "Because there's no need." "Well, excuse me, because I'm going, that's all. Will you take me?" He turned to Dolokhov. "Why not?" Dolokhov answered distractedly, peering into the face of the French drummer boy. "Have you had this little fellow long?" he asked Denisov. "We took him today, but he doesn't know anything. I'm keeping him with me." "And where did the rest disappear to?" asked Dolokhov. "Meaning what? I sent them off and take receipts," Denisov cried, suddenly turning red. "And I say boldly that I don't have a single man on my conscience. It's hard for you to send 30 or even 300 men to town under escort. Instead, I'll say it outright instead of besmirching the honor of a soldier." "Such niceties won't be fitting for the little 16-year-old count here," Dolokhov said with a cold smirk. "But it's time you gave them up." Such niceties would be fitting of the little 16-year-old count here. It's time you gave them up. "What? I'm not saying anything. I'm only saying that I'll definitely go with you," Petya said timidly. "But for you and me, brother, it's time to drop these niceties," Dolokhov went on, as if he found a special pleasure in talking about this subject which irritated Denisov. "Now, why have you taken this one with you?" he said, shaking his head. "Because you feel sorry for him. We know those receipts of yours. You send off 100 men, 30 will arrive, the rest will starve to death or be killed. Does it make any difference if you don't take them?" The Esau, narrowing his pale eyes, nodded approvingly. "That makes no difference. There's nothing to discuss. I don't want to take it on my soul. You say they'll die. Very well, as long as it's not because of me." Dolokhov laughed. "And who told them not to capture me 20 times over? But if they do, for me and for you, with all your chivalry, it's the same aspen tree." He paused. "Anyhow, we've got to get down to business. Send for my Cossack with the bundle. I'll have 2 French uniforms. Well, are you coming with me?" he asked Petya. "Me? Yes, definitely," cried Petya, blushing almost to the point of tears and glancing at Denisov. While Dolokhov was arguing with Denisov about what to do with the prisoners, Petya had again felt uneasy and hurried. But again, he had not quite managed to understand what they were talking about. If the big, famous ones think like that, it means it must be so. It means it's good, he thought. And above all, Denisov mustn't think that I'll obey him, that he can command me. I'll definitely go to the French camp with Dolokhov. If he can, I can. To all Denisov's persuasions not to go, Petya replied that he was also used to doing everything neatly and not any old way, and that he never thought about the danger to himself. "Because you yourself will agree, if we don't know for certain how many there are, the lives of hundreds may depend on it, and here it's just us. I also want it very much, and I'll definitely go. I will. You won't hold me back," he said. "That will only be worse." Children. Section 9. Having put on a French uniform and shakos, Petya and Dolokhov rode to the clearing with which Denisov had looked at the camp. Riding out of the forest in total darkness, descending into the hollow, on reaching the bottom, Dolokhov told the Cossacks who accompanied them to wait there and rode at a sturdy trot down the road to the bridge. Petya, his heart thrilling with excitement, rode beside him. "If we're caught, I won't surrender alive. I've got a pistol," Petya whispered. "Don't speak Russian," Dolokhov said in a quick whisper. At the same moment, they heard a call from the darkness. Que vif! And the cocking of a musket. Who goes there? The blood rushed to Petch's face, and he gripped his pistol. Lanciers du... Septem? Lanciers du Septem? Lanciers of the 6th, said Dólokhov, without slowing or increasing the pace of his horse. The black figure of the sentry stood on the bridge. Mont de Audrey? Password? Dólokhov reined in his horse and rode slowly. Dis donc le Colonel Gerard est ici? He said. Tell me, is Colonel Gerard here? Mont Audrey. D'Audrey. Password, the sentry said without replying, and barred his way. Quand un officier fait sa ronde, le sentinelle ne demandait pas le mont de Audrey, cried Dólokhov. When the officer is making his rounds, the sentries do not ask for the password. Suddenly flaring up and riding his horse into the sentry, Je vous demande si le colonel est ici? I ask you, is the colonel here? And not waiting for a reply from the sentry, who stepped aside, Dólokhov rode up the hill at a walk. Noticing the black shadow of a man crossing the road, Dólokhov stopped him and asked where the commander and the officers were. This man, with a sack on his back, a soldier, stopped, came up close to Dólokhov's horse, touched it with his hand, and told him simply and amicably that the commander and the officers were further up the hill, to the right, in the courtyard of the farmhouse, as he called the manor house. Riding up the road, from both sides of which came the sounds of French talk around the campfires, Dólokhov turned into the courtyard of the big manor house. Riding through the gates, he got off his horse and went up to a big, blazing campfire around which several men sat talking loudly. In a pot at the edge of the fire, something was cooking, and a soldier in a cap and blue uniform on his knees, brightly lit up by the fire, was stirring it with a ramrod. Oh, ce sont deux en cure. Oh, he's a hard nut to crack, said one of the officers sitting in the shadow on the opposite side of the fire. Il laisse faire marcher les lapins. He'll make the rabbits scurry, another laughed. They both fell silent, peering into the darkness at the sound of Dólokhov's and Petch's footsteps as they approached the fire with their horses. Bonjour, messieurs, Dólokhov said loudly and distinctly. The officers stirred in the shadow of the fire, and one, a tall officer with a long neck, went up to Dólokhov. C'est vous, Clement? He said. Is that you, Clement? Diable, what the devil? But he did not finish, realizing his mistake, and frowning slightly, greeted Dólokhov as a stranger, asking what he could do for him. Dólokhov told him that he and his comrade were trying to catch up with their regiment, and asked, addressing them all in general, whether the officers knew anything about the 6th Regiment. No one knew anything, and Petcha thought that the officers were beginning to look at him and Dólokhov with animosity and suspicion. For a few seconds they were all silent. Si vous comptez sur la soupe de soie, vous venez trop tard. If you're counting on the evening soup, you're too late, a voice said from behind the fire with restrained laughter. Dólokhov replied that they were not hungry and had to be on their way that night. He handed the horses to the soldier who was stirring the pot and squatted by the fire next to the officer with the long neck. This officer, not taking his eyes off Dólokhov, again asked what regiment he was from. Dólokhov did not reply, as if he had not heard the question, and lighting up a short French pipe that he had took from his pocket, asked the officers how far the road ahead was safe from Cossacks. Les brigands sont partout. The brigands are everywhere, replied the officer from behind the fire. Dólokhov said the Cossacks were only a fear for stray ones like him and his comrade, but added questioningly that they probably did not dare to attack large detachments. No one made any reply. Well, now he'll leave, Petcha kept thinking every moment, standing before the fire and listening to his conversation. But Dólokhov began the stalled conversation again and started asking directly how many men were in their battalion, how many battalions, how many prisoners. Asking about the Russian prisoners who were with their detachment, Dólokhov said, Le vilain affaire d'estraîner ces cadavres après soi. Voudrait mieux ficeler cette canal. Nasty business dragging these corpses behind you. Better to shoot the scum. And burst loudly into strange laughter that Petcha thought the French would see through the deceit at once, and he involuntarily stepped back from the fire. No one responded to Dólokhov's words and laughter, and the French officer who could not be seen, he was lying wrapped in his greatcoat, rose slightly and whispered something to his comrades. Dólokhov got up and called the soldier with the horses. Will they bring the horses or not? Wondered Petya, involuntarily moving close to Dólokhov. The horses were brought. Bonjour, messieurs, said Dólokhov. Petya wanted to say bonsoir, but could not bring the word out. The officers were whispering something among themselves. Dólokhov took a long time mounting his horse, which would not stand still. Then he rode along the gates at a walk. Petya rode beside him, wishing and not daring to turn around to see if the French were running after them or not. Coming out to the road, Dólokhov did not ride back to the field, but went through the village. In one place he stopped, listening. You hear? He said. Petya recognized the sounds of Russian voices and saw the dark figures of Russian prisoners by the fires. Descending to the bridge, Petya and Dólokhov rode past the sentry, who gloomily paced the bridge without saying a word, and went down into the hollow where the Cossacks were waiting. Well, and now goodbye. Tell Denisov it's set for dawn at the first shot, said Dólokhov, and he was about to leave, but Petya seized him by the sleeve. No, he cried. You're such a hero. Oh, how good, how excellent, how I love you. All right, said Dólokhov, but Petya would not let go of him, and in the darkness Dólokhov made out that Petya was leaning towards him. He wanted to kiss. Dólokhov kissed him, laughed, and turned his horse, disappearing into the darkness. And that is the end, and we will wait, and we will accomplish their battle or ambush tomorrow. So there you have it. That's enough for today. Oh, it's so funny. Petya is such a kid. He's only 16, but he's like, I'm a man. But all his manners of behavior are those of a kiddo. So, anyways, let's see. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know how the sound quality is. I'm worried too that maybe some of the microphones need to be a little closer, so we'll see how that is affected. But yeah, I will see you guys tomorrow. We will pick up and see how the Denisov-Dólokhov ambush goes with Petya in tow. And I wonder what's happening to our dear Pierre, because he is still a Russian prisoner with the French on the move, taken out of, as they abandoned Moscow, taken with them. And I wonder what's happening with Prince Andrei. Well, sorry, not Prince Andrei. He's dead. Sorry about that. I'm wondering what's happened with Nikolai Rostov, the older brother, and Princess Maria, and Natasha, and Sonia, and we'll see. Anyways, I hope you guys have a great day, and I will catch up with y'all tomorrow. Bye.